Marcus froze for a split second, the pounding rain soaking through his uniform as he processed the scene before him. The towering oak tree that once stood proudly in the Harrisons' yard now lay sprawled across their sleek black SUV, its heavy branches pinning the vehicle in place. Through the shattered windshield, he could see Mrs. Harrison and Emily trapped inside, their terrified faces illuminated by the flickering interior lights. Without hesitation, Marcus sprinted toward the car, his boots splashing through puddles forming in the driveway. His heart pounded in his chest, adrenaline surging through his veins as he reached the driver's side door and yanked on the handle. It didn't budge. The weight of the tree had crushed the front end of the car, warping the metal and trapping them inside. "Hold on!" Marcus shouted, his voice barely cutting through the howling wind and pounding rain. Emily, wide-eyed and panicked, pressed her hands against the window. "Please, help us!" she cried, her voice trembling. Marcus scanned the wreckage, his mind racing for a solution. The passenger door looked less damaged, but the heavy branches blocked any direct access. He needed leverage, something to pry the door open. Turning back toward the house, he spotted a crowbar lying in the open garage. Without thinking twice, he dashed inside and grabbed it. Returning to the car, Marcus braced himself against the rain and jammed the crowbar into the door seam, using all his strength to pry it open. The metal groaned in protest, but it didn't give way. Inside the car, Mrs. Harrison's breathing was ragged, and Emily's sobs filled the air. "I'm scared, Mom," she whimpered, clutching her mother's arm tightly. "You're doing great. Just stay with me," Marcus said, his voice calm despite the chaos. "I'm getting you out of here. I promise." Finally, with one last forceful pull, the door creaked open just enough for Emily to squeeze through. Marcus reached in and carefully pulled her to safety, shielding her from the wind with his own body. "Are you okay?" he asked, kneeling beside her. Emily nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Mom's still in there," she gasped. Marcus didn't waste a second. He reached back into the car, helping Mrs. Harrison unbuckle her seatbelt and guiding her out of the wreckage. The moment she was free, she collapsed onto the wet pavement, gasping for air. You saved us," she whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of relief and disbelief. Mr. Harrison, who had been watching from the front door, finally rushed out, his face pale with shock. He grabbed his wife and daughter, holding them tightly. For a moment, he didn't acknowledge Marcus, his eyes filled with guilt and gratitude at the same time. Marcus wiped rain from his face, taking a step back, ready to leave. But Mrs. Harrison, still catching her breath, looked up at him with something different in her eyes, something softer. "Marcus," she said, for the first time addressing him by name instead of ignoring him. "Thank you. I don't know what we would have done without you." Marcus gave a small nod. "Just glad you're both okay, ma'am," he said, his voice even but sincere. As he turned to walk back to his truck, he heard Mr. Harrison clear his throat. "Wait," he called out, his voice hesitant but firm. Marcus stopped in his tracks, surprised. "I'm sorry," Mr. Harrison continued, his eyes meeting Marcus's for the first time without the usual suspicion. For how we've treated you. I was wrong." Marcus, though taken aback, saw the sincerity in the man's face. He simply nodded and replied, "It's all right. Take care of your family." As Marcus drove away into the storm, he couldn't help but feel a shift in the air, not just from the weather, but from something deeper. He had always believed that kindness could break down walls, but tonight, he had seen it firsthand. And for the first time, he felt that maybe, just maybe, the Harrisons had too. Marcus didn't waste a second. Ignoring the sharp gusts of wind and the pounding rain, he sprinted toward his truck, his heart hammering against his ribs. The storm had turned the quiet suburban street into a scene of chaos. Branches scattered across the pavement, power lines swaying dangerously, and the relentless downpour blurring his vision. Mr. Harrison stood frozen on the porch, his face pale with fear as he shouted frantically into his phone, but Marcus knew the truth. Emergency services wouldn't get here in time. Inside the crushed SUV, Mrs. Harrison and Emily banged against the fogged-up windows, their terrified faces barely visible through the rain-streaked glass. Emily's screams pierced through the storm, and Marcus could see the rising water pooling at their feet inside the car. They didn't have much time. Grabbing a tire iron from his truck, Marcus ran back, the cold metal feeling heavy in his hands. He positioned himself at the rear window, glancing at Mrs. Harrison through the glass. "Cover your eyes!" he shouted, his voice barely carrying over the howling wind. Mrs. Harrison shielded Emily's face as Marcus swung the tire iron with all his strength. The glass shattered with a deafening crash, shards scattering inside the vehicle. Rain poured into the car as Marcus reached inside, carefully gripping Emily's trembling hand. "Come on, sweetheart, I got you," he said gently, pulling her through the broken window. Emily sobbed as she clung to him, her small frame shivering violently from the cold and shock. "You're safe," he whispered, carrying her swiftly away from the wreckage and placing her under the porch where Mr. Harrison stood helplessly. Without a moment's pause, Marcus turned back to the car, locking eyes with Mrs. Harrison. She was visibly shaken, her hands trembling as she struggled to unbuckle her seatbelt. "Take a deep breath, ma'am," Marcus reassured her, reaching in and carefully helping her through the shattered window. As he guided her out, her legs gave way, and she collapsed into his arms, coughing and gasping for air. Both women were drenched and shaking, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. Mrs. Harrison looked up at Marcus, shock and gratitude etched across her face. You saved us," she stammered, her voice cracking. Marcus nodded, his face calm despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "Just doing what anyone would do," he said humbly, brushing off the rain dripping from his forehead. Mr. Harrison stepped forward, his eyes darting between his wife and daughter, relief flooding his features. His expression, however, was conflicted, pride warring with gratitude. He cleared his throat and muttered, "Thanks." The word came out stiff as though it was foreign to him, but Marcus didn't dwell on it. Instead, he placed a steady hand on Mr. Harrison's shoulder and asked, "Is everyone okay?" He didn't need praise or thanks, he just wanted to make sure they were safe. Mrs. Harrison, still trembling, nodded weakly. I think so." She reached for Emily, wrapping her arms tightly around her daughter, her chest rising and falling with heavy sobs. The storm raged on around them, but for a moment it felt as though time had stopped. Marcus led them further under the porch, ensuring they were sheltered from the rain and wind. He quickly checked Mrs. Harrison's arms for any cuts from the shattered glass, but aside from a few minor scrapes, she appeared unharmed. "We need to get inside," Marcus said firmly. "The storm's getting worse." Mr. Harrison hesitated, glancing toward the open front door, as if torn between letting Marcus into his home and keeping his pride intact. Mrs. Harrison, sensing the tension, spoke up. "Please, come inside," she said softly. "You shouldn't be out there in this." Marcus hesitated for a brief moment before nodding. "All right, let's get you both inside first." Once inside the warm, well-furnished home, Marcus helped Mrs. Harrison to the couch while Emily curled up beside her, still clinging to her mother. Mr. Harrison stood near the entrance, watching silently, his usual hard demeanor softened by the weight of the situation. The silence stretched until Mrs. Harrison broke it with a trembling voice. "You risked your life for us," she said, tears filling her eyes. We owe you so much more than a thank you." Marcus gave a small smile, his voice gentle. "I'm just glad you're safe." Mr. Harrison shifted uncomfortably, running a hand through his wet hair before finally meeting Marcus's gaze. He started, his voice faltering. He sighed, the tension in his shoulders slowly easing. "I've been wrong about you," he admitted, his voice low but sincere, "about a lot of things." Marcus simply nodded, knowing that the storm outside wasn't the only thing that had changed tonight. Sometimes it took moments of crisis to break down walls that had been built over years. As the rain continued to pour outside, Mrs. Harrison reached for Marcus's hand, squeezing it lightly. "You didn't have to help us, but you did," she said softly, "and we'll never forget it." Marcus, his heart still racing from the rescue, simply said, "Sometimes, helping people is just what you do." The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind broken branches and scattered debris across the neighborhood. But what lingered most was the story of what had happened at the Harrison household. News of Marcus's selfless act spread like wildfire, traveling through morning coffee conversations, neighborhood group chats, and even the local newspaper. People who had once barely acknowledged Marcus when he drove through the neighborhood were now pointing and whispering in admiration. "Can you believe that delivery guy saved the Harrisons?" Mrs. Jenkins, a longtime resident, said to her friend at the corner cafe. "They're lucky he was there, I'll tell you that." The Harrisons, a family that had always kept a careful distance from their neighbors, suddenly found themselves at the center of attention. Mrs. Harrison received calls from acquaintances she hadn't spoken to in years, asking if she and Emily were okay. Mr. Harrison, normally stoic and detached, was seen shaking hands with neighbors who had never dared approach him before. Despite the shift in their usual guarded demeanor, Marcus couldn't help but wonder if the gratitude they expressed to him was genuine or simply a reaction to the relief of being alive. He noticed how, even in their public expressions of thanks, the Harrisons still seemed hesitant, like they were grappling with their pride and the unexpected reliance they had placed on him. "Marcus, you're a hero," a neighbor called out as he made his usual deliveries the next day, smiling warmly. Marcus, ever humble, simply shook his head. "I just did what anyone would do," he replied, his smile modest but kind. When a local reporter showed up at the neighborhood to cover the story, Marcus reluctantly answered a few questions, standing by his truck as the journalist's camera crew filmed him. "I didn't do it for attention," Marcus said, wiping sweat from his brow. "I saw people in trouble and did what I hope anyone else would do for me." Mrs. Harrison, who had been watching from her porch, stepped forward nervously and spoke into the microphone. "We owe him our lives," she said, glancing toward Marcus with an expression of genuine appreciation. "He didn't hesitate, not for a second." However, not everyone was quick to change their perspective. Some whispered behind closed doors, hesitant to acknowledge the deeper implications of Marcus's actions. "Imagine if he hadn't been there," one neighbor murmured skeptically. "Would they even be thanking him now?" Despite the praise and media attention, Marcus continued his work as usual, dropping off packages and flashing his easy smile to customers. He didn't let the newfound recognition change him. He had always done his job with dignity, and he intended to keep it that way. Meanwhile, the Harrisons faced an internal reckoning of their own. Sitting in their pristine living room, Emily scrolled through social media, reading comments from people praising Marcus and criticizing the family's past treatment of him. "Dad," she said hesitantly, "do you think people are right? Have we been wrong about him?" Mr. Harrison sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know," he admitted, staring out the window where Marcus's truck had just driven by. "But I do know that man put his life on the line for us. That's more than I can say for a lot of people." Mrs. Harrison, sipping her tea thoughtfully, nodded. "We need to do more than just say thank you," she said quietly. "We need to show it." A few days later, as Marcus finished another delivery route, he found the Harrisons waiting by their front door. This time, they weren't just there to watch him leave. Mrs. Harrison held out a carefully wrapped gift, and Mr. Harrison extended his hand. "We wanted to properly thank you," he said, his voice softer than usual. "Not just for what you did that night, but for everything." Marcus took the gift, glancing between them. "You didn't have to do this," he said. "No, we did," Emily chimed in, stepping forward with a small smile. "You saved us, and I guess we never really took the time to know you before." For the first time, Marcus felt a shift, something real. Maybe their opinions had started to change, or maybe they were just beginning to see him as more than the guy who dropped off their packages. Either way, it was a step in the right direction. As he left their home, Marcus realized that sometimes change wasn't about grand gestures or instant transformation. It was about small moments, moments that, over time, could bridge even the deepest divides. Standing in the bustling warehouse of his delivery hub, Marcus stared down at the package in his hands, his name carefully written across the top in neat cursive. He felt a strange mix of curiosity and apprehension as he carefully tore it open. Inside, he found a crisp envelope with the familiar address of the Harrison family printed in the corner. Taking a deep breath, he unfolded the letter and began to read. "Marcus, we owe you more than just thanks. We owe you an apology. We judged you unfairly without ever knowing you, and that was wrong. You saved our lives, and in doing so, you've made us realize how blind we've been. Please accept this small token of our appreciation." The words hit him harder than he expected. He had long since accepted the way the world worked, the way people like the Harrisons looked at him with suspicion, assuming the worst without ever bothering to see him for who he truly was. But now, reading their heartfelt words, he felt something shift deep within him, something he wasn't sure he'd ever feel coming from them. Alongside the letter was a neatly wrapped gift card to a local store, tucked beneath another smaller note with a handwritten invitation. "We'd love for you to join us for dinner at our home. No pressure, just an opportunity to get to know each other better. Thank you again. The Harrisons." Marcus stood frozen, rereading the words, feeling their sincerity in every carefully chosen phrase. He had never expected an apology, let alone an invitation to sit at their table. The very people who had once barely acknowledged him were now reaching out in a way he had never thought possible. "Everything all right, man?" one of his co-workers asked, walking by with a stack of boxes. Marcus nodded slowly, folding the letter and slipping it back into the envelope. "Yeah," he said with a small smile. "Just, unexpected." That evening, as Marcus sat in his truck after finishing his last delivery, he found himself staring at the invitation once more. He had every reason to decline, to hold on to the years of cold stares and dismissive attitudes, to let their past actions speak louder than their apology. But deep down, he knew change had to start somewhere. Taking a deep breath, he picked up his phone and dialed the number at the bottom of the note. Mrs. Harrison answered almost immediately, her voice nervous yet hopeful. "Mrs. Harrison, it's Marcus," he said, feeling the weight of the moment. "I'd be happy to join you for dinner." The relief in her voice was palpable. "That's wonderful, Marcus. We're looking forward to it." Hanging up, Marcus leaned back in his seat, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. For the first time, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, real change was possible. A week after receiving the heartfelt letter and invitation, Marcus found himself standing once again at the Harrisons' front door. This time, the familiar tension in his chest wasn't as strong. The house that once felt like a place of silent judgment now seemed different, warmer, more inviting. Before he could knock, the door swung open, revealing Mrs. Harrison with a bright, genuine smile on her face. "Marcus, it's so good to see you," she said, holding out a cup of tea. "I thought you might like something warm with all this chilly weather." Marcus hesitated for a moment before accepting the cup with a nod of appreciation. "Thank you, ma'am," he said, feeling the warmth seep through his cold fingers. Mr. Harrison soon appeared in the doorway, looking slightly uncomfortable but making an effort. "Marcus," he said, clearing his throat and extending his hand stiffly. Marcus looked at the outstretched hand for a second before shaking it firmly. The handshake wasn't just a greeting, it was an unspoken acknowledgement, a silent apology. Emily, standing behind her parents, offered him a shy smile. "Thanks again for everything," she said softly. I was wrong about you." Her cheeks flushed with embarrassment, but there was sincerity in her voice. Marcus gave her a small smile. "We all make mistakes," he said kindly, though he made sure to add, "but it's what we do after that matters." There was a brief silence before Mrs. Harrison spoke up. "That's exactly why we invited you to dinner. We want to do better, Marcus. We realized that we've been living in a bubble, and, well, we'd like to change that." Marcus looked at them, seeing a flicker of something new in their eyes, genuine regret mixed with the desire to make things right. "I appreciate that," he said, his voice steady. "But change isn't just about words, it's about actions." Mr. Harrison nodded, his usual stern expression softening. "You're right," he admitted, "and we've been thinking a lot about that." The dinner that followed was unlike anything Marcus had expected. Instead of awkward conversation, the Harrisons genuinely listened. They asked him about his life, his experiences, his aspirations. Emily asked about his favorite delivery routes, and Mrs. Harrison eagerly shared stories about her own upbringing, realizing for the first time that they had more in common than she'd ever thought possible. Halfway through the meal, Mr. Harrison set down his fork and cleared his throat. "Marcus," he said, his voice serious but softer than before. "We're planning to hold a neighborhood gathering, something to bring everyone together, and we'd like your input." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "My input?" Mrs. Harrison nodded. "Yes, we want to make sure it's inclusive, something that shows everyone in this community matters. We realize now that we've been distant, and it's time to change that." Marcus leaned back in his chair, considering their words. It wasn't what he had expected when he walked through their door, but it was a step. "All right," he said finally, "I'd be happy to help." Over the following weeks, the Harrisons became surprising advocates for change within their community. They shared their experience with friends and neighbors, openly acknowledging their mistakes and encouraging others to open their hearts and minds. They reached out to community leaders, supporting local initiatives that promoted inclusivity and diversity. Their transformation didn't go unnoticed. People who once saw them as distant and unapproachable now found them leading efforts to bring the community together. Whether it was organizing charity drives or simply taking the time to engage with their neighbors, the Harrisons were no longer just bystanders in their own neighborhood. And Marcus? He continued doing what he did best, showing kindness, one delivery at a time. Though he appreciated the Harrisons' efforts, he didn't let the experience change who he was. Instead, he used it as a reminder that even the smallest actions, like delivering a package with a smile, could plant the seeds of change. One afternoon, as Marcus pulled up to the Harrisons' home to drop off another delivery, he was met with a familiar but now entirely different sight. Mr. Harrison was out on the porch, chatting with their black neighbors, something Marcus would have never imagined before. Mrs. Harrison was helping organize supplies for a community outreach event, and Emily was waving at him with a bright smile. As Marcus handed over the package, Mrs. Harrison gave him a knowing look. "We're trying, Marcus," she said. "One step at a time." Marcus nodded, tipping his cap. "That's all anyone can do." Driving away, he couldn't help but smile. Life had a way of breaking down barriers in the most unexpected ways, and sometimes all it took was a storm to bring people closer together.